we go. Good evening, everybody. Tonight's class is sponsored Lili Nishmas Tova Miriam Bas Will. That is Mrs. Eliana Wadika's sister. Yortzeit is tonight. Neshama should have an Aliyah. We're very excited to have my friend from Yeshiva days, Rabbi Yitzi Magalnick, who today is a shliach in California, but he's joined us not to talk about what he's doing today, but about his involvement in the story that we are going to be commemorating the victory of a little bit later this week on the 5th day of Teves. So, first of all, Rabbi Yitzi, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Is that a real background, or those real Sfarim, or those virtual? That's the first thing we want to know.
It's a background. It's a facade.
It's a facade. Okay.
You can see how brand new those books look like.
No, the spines aren't cracked. So let's review just quickly to set the scene, and maybe not everybody is familiar with it. Let's set the scene. So in 1985, almost 40 years ago, in the summertime Farbrengen, the Rebbe started to mention about a very unfortunate incident. You can Google it and look up more of the details, but essentially what it led to was there were people who were, one person in particular, who was going into the Chabad library. Many people here have been at 770. If you're facing 770 to the right, which is the west, there's another building, which is known as the library. And there's all kinds of an enormous amount of Sfarim, one of the largest repositories of Judaica in the whole world, certainly in the United States, and including many rare books, the Siddur that belonged to the Baal Shem Tov, things of this nature. And very tragically, without having to linger on the sad side of it, but a family member of the previous Rebbe, his grandson, was stealing them and selling them for profit. And the Rebbe spoke about this. People tried to intervene and hope to retrieve these books peacefully, maybe just give him some money if that's what he was after. But on the contrary, he became even more belligerent, and it wound up going to court. So just to fast forward why we're talking about this now, this all is transpiring in the summer through the winter of 1985. And around this time of year, actually on the 19th of Kislev, which is a very significant day in the Chabad calendar, you remember there was the communal Farbrengen, this trial began. And the trial featured, obviously, a Gentile judge, a man named Judge Sifton, and Chabad presented the information about how these treasures were not the personal property of the previous Rebbe, but rather the previous Rebbe is the embodiment of the community. And these books were donated, or the funds through which these books were purchased were not just given to him as a private citizen, but were given to him as a trustee for the entirety of the community. The trial lasted a couple of weeks, and then you wait for a decision. Almost a full year later, on the 5th day of Teves, which we'll commemorate on Thursday, the judge issued the ruling that, in fact, the library belonged in its entirety to the Chabad community. And then there was an appeal, which was eventually rejected. And almost another full year later, on the 2nd day of the month of Kislev, which we just celebrated that about a month ago, the books were actually returned. Now, in the interim, these are books that they get sold. They're not sold to me. They're sold to people who collect them as art. And when the people heard about this thievery, these are things that are done very clandestinely, and you have to try and retrieve them. And the Rebbe assured that he would reimburse anybody who had expended any money. It wasn't really about the money; it's about the pursuit and the prize. And this is 1985 or so, and that's where Rabbi Magalnick comes in to tell us his personal participation in this story. So lay it on us, my brother.
Well, first of all, Shalom Aleichem, and thank you for having me on. And it's now I learned. I was reminded that it's 2 hours. You guys are 2 hours ahead of us,
right?
So, by the way, Rabbi Epstein, my day was revolving around 6 o'clock tonight.
Oh,
I had
sorry.
to get to the airport. So anyhow, it all worked out, Baruch Hashem, and I'm really delighted to be here.
I'm happy to have you. Thank you.
Yeah. So I was born and raised in Crown Heights in Brooklyn. And my whole life, I pretty much was in the circle of the Rebbe, meaning I saw the Rebbe at least once a week, which was on Shabbos. if not, multiple times during the week if I went to his shul to daven on a weekday davening or for Brangen. So as a child, I grew up in Crown Heights, and as I mentioned, I davened in 770. And one of the places as a kid before Bar Mitzvah where we hung out was in the basement. The shul itself is in the basement, and the back of the shul, there's a part where there's an elevator, and there were these interesting rooms with gates, that with a very flimsy kind of a lock. But nobody really bothered to try to open it. But we always wondered. It was like, it was a mystery. What was inside? So the kids were debating if it was junk. Some people said the previous Rebbe's items were there, and other kids said there are books there. Nobody knew anything what it was all about. But fast forward, when I was 18 years old, I went to study in Israel and in Jerusalem. And the year was uneventful. It was a regular year. And American yeshiva boys get off by June time, a little bit after Shavuot. You get off and you go to camp, you become a counselor. Being that I was in an Israeli yeshiva, I had to remain in the yeshiva until after the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. I was a little bummed out about it because I wasn't able to go to camp, and I was trying to negotiate with my parents, and my parents very much wanted me to complete my year, which would mean that I would have to stay through part of the summer, which I did. Israel, of course, the time zone is a different time zone. They're ahead of the East Coast, New York. And whenever the Rebbe made a weekday Farbrengen, we would have to wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning. So, there were various different Farbrengens throughout the year. And I can tell you that I loved going to the Farbrengen, but I dreaded waking up. There was this one kid. When I say kid, he was like younger than me. He must have been 17, not that much younger. He didn't really like to learn. He was like the kid, like we say in Yiddish, he had no Sitzfleisch. He was, had ADD, on steroids. But he loved the Rebbe, and he loved to wake us up at 4 in the morning. He would come in with an iron bar, and our beds, the frame were made out of metal, and he bashed that bed. It just didn't pay to stay in bed. It was just, you had to get out of bed. Anyhow, that went on the whole year. Anytime we had those Farbrengens, and we would listen to the Rebbe's talk. It came to Yud Beis Tammuz, which is actually the day that we mark the anniversary of the liberation of the previous Rebbe in 1927. And it was just an ordinary Farbrengen. Had to wake up, and you come downstairs and you're sitting there and you're barely awake. And I'm listening to the Farbrengen, or half listening to the Farbrengen. Some parts I understood, some parts I'm dozing off. And all of a sudden, at some point during the Farbrengen, we started hearing the Rebbe literally like scream, but not screaming because he was angry, but he was screaming because there was deep pain in the Rebbe, something from the bottom of his heart. And he was using very funny language. He was saying that if they touch these things, they're like bombs and they're going to explode. And I'm looking around and everybody's looking at each other, and we're trying to figure out what is the Rebbe talking about. So nobody really had an inkling. And then there were, it was the Rebbe was talking. And after the Rebbe finished speaking, everybody was gathering together. Everybody surrounded the smartest guy in the room and tried to get the information from him. And he didn't know what was going on. But what we learned from that talk was that the Rebbe was in great distress and great pain. And it was much more than what meets the eye, because in the beginning we thought, it's just a bunch of books. They belong to the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. So either we'll negotiate it, we'll buy it, or we'll work out some deal. But there was no clarity. As time went on, things became a little bit more clear what was happening. And this was something that was very, very serious. And it wasn't even until years later that we got a lot of the details as to what happened. So that's where I was when we first heard what happened about the books. It's one of those days that people remember where they were when President Kennedy was killed. It's one of those days you remember 9/11. Exactly where you were, and you just have a very visual memory. You could just remember what you were doing and how you were feeling, and so that's that's how I remember the beginning of when we were introduced to what happened. There's a lot of details to the story that we could probably spend a lot of time. So I'm not sure how much time we have. What do you say, Rabbi Epsu? How much more?
We're listening. You talk, we listen. That's the deal.
All right. So what's very important for people to understand here is it was much more than about an inheritance story, because the argument was about an inheritance. That was that was what met the eye was, okay, so the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe had a library, and he spent his whole life acquiring these books. He bought the books, and people gave him these books as gifts. And the library spanned from anti-God, anti-religion, I don't know about anti-Jewish, but things that are heretical in Jewish life. We would not allow our children to read those books, but those books existed in the library. But primarily, the books were manuscripts from the Chabad Rebbes. It had the Baal Shem Tov Siddur in it. It had, I believe, the first Haggadah that was ever printed. It had a lot of stuff in it that were monetarily very valuable. So people thought to themselves, well, Chabad, the Rebbe, is now in an argument with, it was a family member from the Rebbe's house, from the Rebbe's nephew is the one who argued that it belonged to him. And so this is a family dispute, and we'll figure out how to resolve it. That's what we all thought in the beginning. There must be some kind of resolution. There must be some way that this can be either brought to some arbitration, some diplomacy. Something is going to happen, and it's going to get fixed up. But what we also knew was that the Rebbe was in like this deep pain that I don't think anybody, I know nobody ever heard the Rebbe speak with such pain, personal pain. And what we started to realize, and this is even after we won the case, that what really was on the line was the leadership of Chabad. I'm sure Rabbi Epstein has discussed, what exactly is a Rebbe. A Rebbe is not a rabbi. A rabbi, you can pat him on the back and you can have a personal relationship. You can have a friendship with the rabbi. The Rebbe is someone that's much greater. The Rebbe is in a way that not only a teacher, not only a mentor, but the Rebbe puts you in touch with your neshama, puts you in touch with your soul. A Rebbe is one who puts you in touch, which means he puts you in touch with Hashem. The Rebbe himself gave an analogy about what is a Rebbe. A Rebbe is someone who looks for who looks for diamonds. What do you call that the person who does the excavation?
Speculator.
Speculates. It's more than he's a speculator, but he doesn't speculate. He understands I think a geologist, something like that. Anyhow, the Rebbe said that the Rebbe understands souls. He understands what a soul is, where you belong, and he shows you your place, where you're going to find your gold and your silver and your diamonds, meaning where you're going to find your mitzvahs. What place do you have in this world? So the Rebbe understands that. And the Rebbe is crowned as that Rebbe. So by taking the books, literally stealing the books, it really represented that after the previous Rebbe passed away, there was no leadership. So there was a vacuum of leadership, according to the people who took the books. So the leadership of the Rebbe was really on the line. So it was something that went to the heart and the soul of what a Rebbe is, what Hasidim are, what Chabad was all about. It was a very, very deep wound at that point, at that time, that was hurting the Rebbe and the Chabad movement at large. And you can, by extension, say the whole of the Jewish people, as we could see the phenomenal success that Chabad has in reaching, Jewish people throughout the entire world. That was all in jeopardy. And the Rebbe laid out his case, explaining what was going on, and decisions had to be made how this was going to be resolved. At first, there was an attempt to bring it to a rabbinical court, but that really didn't have any legs to it. That wasn't going to work out. So at the end, the decision was that this is going to have to be taken to a court of law, a secular court, and it did go to the one of the courts in the state of New York, and it was a federal case. It was such an important case that they decided, both sides agreed that there would not be a jury, and ultimately the case was heard by Judge Sifton. He wasn't Jewish, and he would have to hear things that in his lifetime he would never expect. I mean, this was, and by the way, if anybody has interest, you can read it up online. All the transcripts are available, and if anybody's interested in law, it's a fascinating case. It really is. And in the case, it speaks about the heart and soul of what a Rebbe is all about. They had, even Elie Wiesel was an expert witness to explain what a Rebbe is. I'm just going to say that I myself I was very fortunate because I remember when the case actually went to court, and I don't remember. I think it was for like a week, like besides Shabbat and Sunday during the weekends. There was no court, but every day I was already now. I left Israel. I came back to the United States. I was learning in Brooklyn, and every day we would go with a bus. The yeshiva boys would go in the morning, and we would stand outside the court to show our support and to say Tehillim. But they had a raffle every morning for people to go into the court, to sit in the gallery, I guess. There weren't that many seats there. So they made two raffles. One was for the young men who had just gotten married, and they would study in what's called a kollel. And so these were just newly married men. And then you had the yeshiva boys. And of the yeshiva boys, there were literally, I don't know, 200-300 boys gathered around the court, and you'd put your name into the basket. I'm the kind of guy that never wins any raffles. I think that was like my second raffle I ever won in my life. And they pull out one raffle, and it was for the kollel guy, and a guy wins it, and he's thrilled. He's going into the courtroom. And then they pull out for the yeshiva boys, and my name gets Yitzi Magalnick. I couldn't believe it. I said, me, I'm going in. And then everybody says, you got to tell us what happened. I'm like, oh shoot, this is like in Hebrew we call it chazara. I have to repeat everything that I heard. So I'm like I have no pen, I have no paper. I have to take mental notes. And this was a long session. This was, by the way, it felt really quickly because it was so interesting. The day I was in the case, the lawyer, Nat Lewin, he was the lead lawyer for Chabad, a tremendous lawyer. He's still living. He should be gesund. He's from Washington, D.C. He's stood before the Supreme Court of the United States. Just a terrific lawyer. And so not only did he have great skills as a lawyer, but he was a scholar, a scholar of Talmud, and he went to yeshiva. So you couldn't pull the wool over his eyes. He really had a deep understanding of Talmud. So the day I came, they were cross-examining one of the expert witnesses from the other side, because the whole trial was hinged on one letter. And the Rebbe is the one who encouraged the lawyers. And I say encouraged because the Rebbe wanted the lawyers to think for themselves, not do what the Rebbe says. They should think like lawyers. He told them, don't treat this trial as Hasidim. Don't be a follower. Treat it as you would as a lawyer. But there was one letter which the previous Rebbe wrote to an organization in Manhattan. This is in the 1940s. And he's asking for and I don't remember the man who the Rebbe addressed, the previous Lubavitch Rebbe.
Marx.
What was his name?
His last name was Marx.
His name was Marx. He was a Jewish man, and he asked him to intervene and bring back the books. And in the letter, the Rebbe makes the claim, the previous Lubavitch Rebbe says that the books belong to Agudas Chasidei Chabad, which is the umbrella organization of the Chabad movement. And clearly, from that letter, it's clear that the library was not his personal library, which means that it's not an inheritance for his kids. It belongs to the movement, so nobody can touch this library.
These books were left in Europe when the previous Rebbe escaped. I mean, there's a war going on. It's not
Correct.
Like just send FedEx to go pick up these books for me.
Right. So this is right after the war, probably after 45. And he's asking Mr. Marx to help him to retrieve manuscripts and books from Russia, Poland, from various different places. And so this letter, which clearly the previous Rebbe states that the library does not belong to him. He doesn't say it doesn't belong to him, but he's saying it belongs to Agudas Hasidic Chabad, the umbrella organization of Chabad. That was the proof that the previous Rebbe acknowledges that the library doesn't belong to him. That was a huge problem for the plaintiff, for the people who are arguing that it's their books. So they had to bring witnesses, expert witnesses, Talmudic scholars, guys with yarmulkes. In fact, one of them was a professor at Yeshiva University, and I don't remember his names, but if you look at the transcripts, you can see his name. He's right there. And he argued that the Rebbe said a white lie. The previous Rebbe did not want to, in any way, shape, or form, connect the library to that it's a personal library, because then it would weaken the case for Mr. Marks to work really hard to get the library. If it's your personal library, go raise the funds and figure out how to find them. That's what they pretty much argued, that the Rebbe said a white lie. So now there began a whole question: can a Rebbe say even a white lie? Sometimes a white lie can be said. I'm not an expert on lying, but and I'm sure nobody here knows about lying. But a white lie, I think we've all committed that sin. But can a Rebbe commit that sin of a white lie? And it was a huge debate. So I came in, I won the raffle to sit in the session where Nat Lewin was cross-examining the rabbinic expert, the Talmudic expert, who made the claim that a white lie was a possibility even for the previous Rebbe. And Nat Lewin, the defense, I'm sorry, we were the plaintiff, so they were the defense. So the plaintiff attorney, which would be Nat Lewin, I don't remember the whole back and forth, and I've read it afterwards, but it's a tremendous back and forth. He literally demolished, decimated this guy. I mean, the guy couldn't speak because they were now having a discussion as though they were in yeshiva. But of course, they had the formalities of the court, so they were respectful, of course. And but Nat Lewin was right on top of this guy. He knew that Gemara. He knew it was actually a Mishnah. It was a Mishnah that they were discussing. So I was very fortunate to be at the case. After that, I had a much better grasp as to what was really going on in this case. So for me, that is the story of Hey Teves, and we celebrate it on Thursday, which will be today's Gimel. So yeah, Thursday is the 5th of Teves. So for Hasidim, this is our celebration where the Rebbe was, I guess, spiritually incarcerated. The Rebbe was imprisoned spiritually.
The whole stature of Rebbe was threatened.
The whole exactly. So, if you take a Rebbe physically, you're taking him away from his Hasidim. This had even greater ramifications for us. So it became our Yom Tov, our connection to the Rebbe in a very, very significant and a very, very deep way. I spoke to the head library of Chabad. His name is Rabbi Levin, and he still runs the library. And I once was speaking to him about the story, and by the way, I'll tell you something very interesting that he told me that's not directly related to this case. I don't know how we got to talking about it, but first let me tell you what he told me about. He said that Chabad after this case, after it was won, he made the claim, this is his claim, that was the best years of Chabad, even though the Rebbetzin passed away a year later in 1988, a year after we won the case. He said that there was something very special because it really sealed and confirmed that the Rebbe is the Rebbe and nobody can ever take that away. That's what he told me. But I'll tell you a side thing. If Rabbi Epstein, is that okay if I tell you one more little story?
Yeah, and then we want to hear your story about transporting the sperm.
Oh, I'll tell you about that. But here's a nice story. I don't know if Rabbi Epstein ever heard of this. We were talking about Yutas Kislev. We were comparing this to Yutas Kislev. So
that's when the first Rebbe was released from Tsarist prison.
Right. So Yutas Kislev would be the equivalent of what for us happened in 1985. This happened in 1810 or something like that. So the first Chabad Rebbe was in prison, physically, literally in prison. That's a whole story that would take a long time. But the Hasidim at that time, they were trying to ransom the Rebbe. It's a big mitzvah, Pidin Shvuyim, to ransom any person that's in prison, let alone your Rebbe. you can only imagine the Jewish community, the Hasidic Chabad community at that time, how much money could they have had? So we know that people literally gave away their silver and their gold, and women gave away their earrings and their diamonds and all their jewelry. And that was almost repeated in the times of Teves. They were raising money. I remember clearly people were giving everything away. I'm not sure if people had to give away their jewelry, but I remember a kid gave away his whole bar mitzvah, like $3,000 that he made for his bar mitzvah. He gave it for the cause. So one of the things he mentioned was that people, the men, if you notice that some men, at least in Shabbat, they have the crown of the talit is silver. They have a silver crown. And it's, today a lot of people walking around with fake silver. But in those days, I guess it was real, authentic silver. And the men pulled off their silver and they gave it away. And they sold it, they melted. I don't know exactly, but they raised money that way. And he said to me that that's a possibility that after they gave away that silver, people couldn't afford, the Chabad Hasidim couldn't afford to buy new silver to replace the crown. From then on till today, if you'll notice at a Chabad shul, typically anybody who's an adherent to Chabad customs and Chabad dress, the talit never ever has the silver. You ever heard of that, Rabbi Epstein?
I've heard the story, yeah. That's why we just have a plain towels with a little silk piece so you know where the towel is.
So that's what he told me. He said he couldn't verify that if it's actually true, but it's very, very likely that it's true.
Okay, so let's hear your story about transporting the sperm, and then we'll let you
My
go.
story. Okay, so this is for me a very, very special story. So going back to my being in the yeshiva in 1985. So after Tisha B'Av, we were free. And
from Israel. This is when you were
in Israel. We were free from school. And I was very excited about that. I was very happy to go home. I spent a whole year there. It was a long time. By the way, that's why I didn't go to Morristown. My grandmother passed away, and my mother wanted very much I should be close to my grandfather's whole story. So I ended up in Israel. And by the way, I became close friends with Shmuley Boteach, and that's why I ended up in Alei Torah. That's a whole other story. Anyhow, so my father was a travel agent. Those who
what's that?
Remember
like
the Chabad community, my father was like the first Jewish travel agent. It was like a non-Jewish business, but in the late 60s, my father started that business, got a bracha from the Rabbi, and he had that business. So he took care of my tickets. But I asked him for a favor. I said, Ta, I have a good friend, Yisrael Herzog, and he invited me to come to his house for like a long weekend. I don't know, I'd leave on a Tuesday, Wednesday, and leave on a Sunday. And I was very excited. I was in England when I was a kid, but I
lives in England. Your friend lived in England.
Yeah, my friend lives in England. Anyhow, so I go. So my father buys me a ticket with El Al, and I end up in England. I arrive in England, and till today I don't even know how I met the kid. And we ended up in what is called Stamford Hill, and we're touring. Came Shabbos morning, that Shabbat morning, like Saturday morning. During davening, I noticed two men, one older and one younger man. During davening,
as we are now, we thought they were older.
They were probably half our age, but I had one white strand, one white hair. I thought the guy was like 95. Anyhow, so they keep looking at me, and every time they look at me, and then they start talking amongst themselves. They're saying something back to each other, and they look at me again, and this is going on. I was like, very strange. I thought that they, I'm a strange face, so they're trying to figure out who I am. But I didn't really feel that important that they really need to know who I am. So it is what it is. Anyhow, after Shemona Esrei, which you can't talk before that, for whatever reason they were talking, maybe they didn't start davening. One of the guys approaches me and he says, are you from New York? I go, yeah, from New York. And when are you leaving? I say, tomorrow, Sunday. He says, okay. And he walks away. That was the end of that. And I had no idea. After Shabbos, I got a call from a rabbi. His name is Rabbi Feivish Vogel, who I had known. And by the way, he was that other man, looking at me. And he calls me up at the house I was staying, and he said to me, if you're going to New York tomorrow, could you take a package for me to back to New York. I said, yeah, it's not, yeah, how big's the package? He asked those kind of questions. So no, it's a small package, and if you can do me that favor. I said, yeah, sure, no problem. So he says to me, I'm gonna come over tonight to the house. So he comes over to the house and he brings me this very funny looking package. Until today, I don't know why it was packaged that way, but it is what it is. It was packaged like somebody packaged it from like the 1800s. It was like wrapped in brown paper, but it looked old. And the string around it was like, I don't know. It was just kind of very, very strange. And he gives it to me and he says to me, I need to talk to you. He says, this is a very important mission that you're on right now. He says he said there were three, no, I remember, he said there were 3 books in here. And these 3 books belong to the Rebbe's library. And these are books that were retrieved in England. Rabbi Feivish Vogel at that time was very, very active in trying to find books that had already been sold. They were stolen and then they were being sold. And the Rebbe wanted very much that these books, the people who bought the books innocently, should be reimbursed for, whatever they spent, make them wholesome. And these books were literally all over Europe, especially in England, because there were book dealers. Anyhow, so he says to me, 3 of those books are in here. And he says to me, basically, he says a few things to me. He says, number 1, you should never, ever take your eyes off these books. You have to hold the books on the plane before you get on the plane, when you leave the plane. That's number 1. The books have to be with you. You cannot take your eyes off the book. I said, okay, no problem. He says, and number 2, as soon as you arrive in New York, whether you're going by taxi, however you're getting to Crown Heights, I want you to bring these books back to Maskiris, to bring it to the Rebbe's secretary's office, the secretariat office. Somebody's going to be waiting for you. You must go right away. You don't go home. Just go straight there. Not a problem. Anyhow, so I took the books and I couldn't sleep a whole night. It's like these books are like right besides me. Sorry. The books are right on the side of me. It's like on a night table. And my friend and his family, they were like, wow, it's unbelievable. The books are here. Anyhow, the next morning I went to the airport and I come to make my flight and I go to the LL counter and the guy tells me, your flight has been canceled. I say, why is my flight canceled? He says, well, typical Israeli style, everybody went on strike. So there are no pilots, there are no mechanics, there's no plane. So I said, what do I do? He says, don't worry, we're transferring you on Pan Am, Olav Shalom. Anybody remember Pan Am, Olav Shalom?
Yeah.
Anyhow, that was actually a few years before the Lockerbie story.
Okay.
Anyhow, so I'm on Pan Am. Now, I asked the guy, where's Pan Am? It was like really far. I just remember just running like a meshugana, and the only thing I really cared about was the books, and I'm holding the books, and I had like a big suit. I'm coming back from Israel after a year, so I had a lot of stuff going on. Those days, there were no wheelies. So I remember I had this thing, the carry-on that was like over my shoulders. It was killing me for a week afterwards. So I have a good memory of that. But somehow I made my way to the Pan Am terminal, and I barely got there. They're ready to close the doors. And I got my boarding pass, let me on. I'm the last guy on the plane. And I'm like schwitzing. And, it's like when you always see that last guy boarding and you're schwitzing, saying,
sure.
Oh, that's the guy who held it up, that's Shlemiel. That's how I felt. Anyhow, I get onto the plane. It's a 747, one of those huge, huge, big planes. And I look at my number. It's like number 210. So I knew I'm definitely not in business class. I'm with the peasants. So I start walking and I'm looking at my number. I'm saying, oh my gosh, this is really bad. I get to my seat and it's the last row by the bathrooms, the middle seat. So there's 3 seats. I'm in the middle. And,
for a 7-hour flight.
And yeah, it's a 7-hour flight. And I said, oh my goodness, this is not going to, I don't have to hold the books. So I start putting my stuff on the overbin thing. And like everybody's like looking at me like in my mind, everybody looked like they were upset at me. And I'm holding and there was a flight attendant trying to help me. And she takes the books from me. And I start shouting at her, you can't take the books. And like, okay, I won't touch the books. And I realized the books I realized how special this was. Anyhow, I sat down and I'm like trying to catch my breath and, get my bearings, and I'm holding the books and now they're looking at me. I'm even stranger. All right, we're sitting and the plane is just sitting there and I'm just waiting for 7 hours to go by. the flight attendant comes back to me, and she says, "Sir, would you mind maybe trading seats with somebody?" In my head, I'm thinking to myself, I'm on the last row, middle seat by the bathrooms. You can only get a better seat. So you can only be upgraded from this point. So I'm like, my eyes open. I said, of course. She says, okay, bring down let's get your stuff. So now we go back and we start taking our stuff. Again, this is another flight attendant. She's taking my books now. And I said, you can't touch my books. And everybody said, what's with the books? Anyhow, she's holding something else. And she says, follow me. Okay, so I start following her, and we're going. And it's a 747, so it's a long plane. It's huge. And like at some point when we went to a section, I felt like she forgot about me. So I said, ma'am, where's my seat? She says, no, keep going. Let's go. I go. And like the next section, I go, excuse me, did you forget about me? And she, no, keep going. The next thing I know is I'm by that, the spiral stairs. And she says, come. I go, no, where's my seat? I'm not flying the plane. She goes, no, come with me. And I go, okay. And we get onto the top level, and now it's first class. There's like 2 seats on each side and lots of room. There's a bar. And she walks me literally to row 1, seat B. I sat on the aisle. And I'm thinking, this is a joke. Someone is playing a joke on me over here. And she says, this is your seat. And she puts and now I'm being treated like I'm in first class. So they're offering me all the goodies. And I don't care about anything because I have to take care of the books. And I'm sitting there and I'm dazed. I'm in a total daze. I asked her why, who switched the seat? So she said to me, there was a woman sitting in that seat and you were sitting next to her friend. And she didn't want to sit for 7 hours not with her friend. She wanted to be with her friend. So she was willing to forego
sit by the bathrooms,
seat B. And so at first I said, yeah, that makes sense. As I'm flying, I said, that lady is nuts. She's out of her mind. Now, my wife's not here, but if my wife was sitting back, I'm there, I'm not so sure I'm going to be going back there. I don't know. She'll have to figure out how to get to first class. That's a joke, of course, Anyhow, so the bottom line is I'm thinking, and this is like amazing. And once I'm more settled, I started to think about it. And I said, there's a spiritual component. I don't know in the history of airlines if anybody's ever traded row 1 for row 210.
200.
I don't think so. So I thought to myself that it was b'schus, the Sfarim, the books that I was returning, that these books had to go in first class. I said this story about 2 years ago, about at this time of the year, I think it was closer to Hanukkah, maybe before Hanukkah, I don't remember, but within a month of Hey Teves, of the day of the celebration. And it was actually at my nephew's Sheva Brachas. This was his 3rd or 4th Sheva Brachas. I had been the MC at his wedding. I spoke at 2 of the Sheva Brachas. I was not being, and the Sheva Brachas was being made by the other family. So I'm just sitting there, no tie, no nothing. I'm just there. I didn't expect that anybody's going to call on me to say anything. And I had nothing prepared. Sometimes if I think they'll ask me, I might prepare something. So I'm sitting there and the father of the Kala is asking, could you speak? And nobody wants to speak. So my brother-in-law, the father of the Chassan, from out of the blue shouts out, he says, Yitzi, get up and say something. I said, Yossi, I have nothing to say. I just, whatever, I wasn't there. So he says, say your Hey Teves story. So I said, okay, let me say the Hey Teves story. So first I wasn't in the mood, and I had to get myself more excited. So I told him the story. A guy comes over to me after the talk, says, come here, I want to show you something. He opens his phone and he opens like a PDF. And he says that in 1962, on Yud Gimel Tammuz, which is the celebration of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, all the Rebbes go to prison. I guess to be a Rebbe, you have to go through some form of prison. Anyhow, the previous Rebbe was in prison in 1927. So 1962, the Rebbe spoke about it. And he shows me that the Rebbe is talking about the story. The Rebbe went over that story beautifully, the Rebbe. And I didn't read the whole thing. He just shows me one paragraph. And I actually made a photocopy today. It's from Teres Menachem. So the Rebbe writes that miraculously, the previous Rebbe was pretty much convicted and sentenced to death. That
This
was the
is
bottom
Stalin.
line.
You know, he just shot
Stalin,
in the
yeah,
back of the
Stalin
head.
was,
And that was it.
he was done. It was the Hasidim, and that's what the Hasidim were very afraid of at that time. But the miracle was that they lowered the sentence, and one of they lowered it ultimately where he was freed completely. But before he was freed completely, they sentenced him to Siberia, to Kostroma, a place called Kostroma. To travel to Kostroma from where was it, Rostov? I think it was Rostov. You're talking days or something. So you went by train. So the Rebbe says the story. I'm just I'm reading it from where they transcribe the Rebbe's talk. And the officials asked the previous Rebbe, so how do you want to get there? And what class in the train would you like to sit? So I guess this first class, with the peasants, and you have the second, I'm sorry, you have the third class, that's the cheapest tickets, middle, and then you have the first
Basic
class.
economy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is really where the communists, the officials, and big dignitaries, only they get to sit in those seats. Now, beggars can't be choosy, and the Rebbe didn't really have that much money. The Rebbe says, "I'm sitting in first class." That's what he says to them. The Rebbe uses a Russian word, I can't even pronounce it. He says, "I'm sitting in that class," and they, by the way, said, "Okay." But they said, you're going to have to pay for the ticket. And somehow they found the money. I don't know where. And they paid. And that's how the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe traveled. He traveled in that class, first class, to go to his exile. So he was pointing out, he says, you see, the previous Rebbe, when he was on his way to freedom, went in first class. And you were bringing the books back into freedom. And that also was first class. Now, just to bring the whole story full circle, who was the guy who told me this? It was a guy named Rabbi Chaim Shulbrook, who Rabbi Epstein knows. And he was the same guy that used to beat the beds with that metal stick. And so I reminded him, I said, I'll never forget the Farbrengen where you threw me out of my bed. Well, all the Farbrengens, especially that one. And I'm glad you did because I was there. So anyhow, that's my little story. But one of the
it's a wonderful story. Did you ever find out which books those specifically were?
No, I was very curious. I didn't even think about opening the. Let me just say, when I arrived in New York, so my father picked me up, and so even to my father, he saw me like almost in a panic. I said to him, "We must go straight to 770 to the Rebbe's secretary's office." My father said, "Why don't you just come home? Unload your bags, say hello to mommy." And I said, no, we must go to 770. I'll tell you about it in the car. My father thought I lost my marbles. Anyhow, I'm sitting in the car and I showed him the bag and I told him. So he realized the seriousness of it. So we went straight to 770. And when we arrived there, Rabbi Klein, I'll never forget, Benjamin Klein was just standing and waiting there. And I can see the sigh of relief. The guy just breathed like, he arrived with the books. I imagine he called Rabbi Vogel at that point to tell him everything is okay. I know that's the story.
That's fantastic, Rabbi Magalnick. Thank you, 1,000 thank yous for sharing that story. Again, we're celebrating Hey Teves on Thursday. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Wish everybody a good night. Tomorrow night we'll learn Maimer at 9:00. Good to be back in the swing of things after a Hanukkah break. Yitzi, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Be well and a good Yontif.
Good Yontif. Thank you very much.
Good Yontif. Good night, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow night.